Welcome everybody, my name is Elias Likes, and today we're talking about cultural unity within Americans, all right? Now during this slideshow, I'll be kind of discussing how cultural movements united America as a whole. Now, a cultural movement is a group of people working together to advance certain cultural goals, all right? Some things to keep in mind during this time period, which was 1920 to 1945, was racism, Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and World War II. Now, racism was at its peak during this time, and the Roaring Twenties was a time period where it was major economic growth. All right. Now, let's talk about some of the key movements. Modernism was a key movement during this time. It was a literature movement, but it was also a cultural one as well. It was the fight between modernists and traditionalists. Now, traditionalists were people who viewed life as it always was. It was a traditional way of thinking. Modernists kind of wanted a sense of reality, how modern life was, the struggles and different things like that they went through. And it really kind of aligned with the realism, because realism was a literature movement that made authors kind of write about the struggles and stuff that everybody went through on a daily basis, things that people can relate to. Before, literature was more fairy tales and happy endings. All right, now a great example of modernism during this time frame was birth control. Birth control was kind of sort of a movement in 1920. It was originally condemned by the church and media. According to Daniel D. Noon from MedicalNet, many felt that sex before marriage and the prevention of pregnancy was wrong. Okay, now during this time, condoms had just became introduced and became legal, and women kind of wanted a sense of control over when they became pregnant, and this kind of interfered with the traditionalist way of thinking, and it just kind of went against their beliefs. So we talked about modernism. We talked about some of the key things during this time period. So let's talk about the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a totally separate, different movement, but it was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City. And it really was the golden age for African Americans. Things like jazz, poetry, opera, all these things were introduced, and it gave Blacks credit for the cultural areas of life. It also dealt with the Great Migration, which was a time period where a lot of African Americans moved from the South to the North. By 1920, Harlem was one of the most popular destinations, holding some of 300,000 African Americans. And that was stated by the National Museum of African American History and Literature. Now, some famous musicians and singers at this time was Duke Ellington, James Baldwin, Bessie Smith, and Louis Armstrong. Okay, those are just to name a few. All right, so we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, we talked about modernism. Now let's get into the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression was a severe economic downturn. It took place primarily in the 1930s, and it kind of had some lingering effects of the Harlem Renaissance. Several Americans at this time found a relief through swing music and movies. And that was proclaimed by the editors from History.com. So Americans kind of wanted a way to escape things. They wanted to put aside their problems and kind of just dance and watch things away. And the Harlem Renaissance kind of gave some reliefs and some methods to that. Now, the new elected president during this time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he really brought back America and put some steps into action that helped us become more united and put America back together piece by piece. One of the things he introduced was the New Deal, which aimed to provide relief for Americans. And he slowly restored confidence by introducing the Works Progress Administration, WPA. Now, WPA mostly employed unskilled men who carried out public work. According to History.com, they built more than 4,000 new school buildings, laid roughly 9,000 miles of storm drains and sanitary sewer lines, built 29,000 new bridges, and planted 24 million trees. And this really helped out severely with the unemployment rate. Before FDR kind of came into play and the Great Depression first started, employment rate was at about, I want to say, just above 20%. And towards the end of this crisis in 1943, the unemployment rate was nearly less than 2%. So it's a major difference, a big difference. All right. So how does this all come together? Now, these movements brought together Americans through struggle, taste, and fashion. Now, the Harlem Renaissance, like I said, was the golden age for African Americans. And it brought together everybody. You know, people had the same taste in music, people had the same taste in fashion, and it was thousands of people working together for a common goal and result bringing us together. The Great Depression had a lot of struggle, and people could relate to each other through the struggle and stuff that they went through. A lot of people were unemployed, a lot of people weren't working, or maybe when it came to the people making bridges and planting trees, people developed a relationship and a meaningful relationship and kind of united. They came together, put together America when it was at its lowest point. Also, which came into play, World War II. I put some pictures in here. It says, "United we win," and working side by side in war and peace. So World War II came into play, and this wasn't a time where people could hold grudges or be divided. People had to come together. People were building stuff for soldiers. They were making factories, and even women played an important role working in those factories and stuff like that, since the men were going overseas and fighting the war. Everybody really stepped out of their comfort zone and put together America, and we became better for it. So that is all. I put some works cited information here. History.com was a major one that helps me kind of find some of my research and interesting facts, as well as the National Museum of African American History and Culture. That was a good one too. So if you guys kind of want to check that out and look at some of the research I found and interesting facts as well. Thank you guys for tuning in. Lights out.